Content warning, this episode contains discussion of the murder of 2 girls.
So we spent most of today in a courtroom in Delphi, Indiana, because today, of course, was the due process hearing in the Richard Allen case. It was also scheduled, of course, to be the suppression hearing in the Richard Allen case.
Previously, we may have forecast a bit that some major things in the case would happen today, and they did.
I think last night, if I recall correctly, we released an episode saying that something big could happen today that could change the way some people view the case, and you can probably guess what that was.
Yeah, we're going to tell you all about our day, and we're also really going to get into the issue of due process as it pertains to Richard Allen. We're going to talk about the possible confessions he has made in the killings of Liberty German and Abigail Williams, and we're going to talk about the filing that Kevin and I made in order to get more documents released to the public so we can all understand this case a bit better. And so we'll cover all that and more coming up. And yeah, there's some pretty big stuff. So this is an important episode. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murder Sheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murder Sheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're the Murder Sheet.
And this is the Delphi murders, possible confessions, due process, and public access to court filings. So we got to the Delphi courthouse like a 5:30 a.m., right?
Right.
We were the first in line. I think there were other people kind of filming outside. Is that fair to say?
And other people soon arrived. And
Yes.
so we were there at about 5:30. The court itself opened at 8, and the hearing began a little after 10.
Yes. Honestly, not as many media figures as I thought were going to be there. I thought there would be a bigger turnout for, sort of the due process / suppression hearing. There was a decent turnout. Space filled up quickly because there was a lot of reserved seats, but it wasn't huge. This wasn't like PCA big in terms of attendance at this hearing.
Yeah, so that was certainly surprising. So a little after 10, I think 10:13, Judge Gull came into the courtroom. She opened the session. She reminded people about the decorum order, and then she started talking about documents.
Yes. And in an indirect way, she was talking about us.
Yes, because, of course, recently, Anya and I, as I'm sure you all know, filed a motion asking for certain documents in the case that, in our view, have been improperly sealed to be open to the public. Some people, I think for some reason, had the idea that Anya and I did this on a whim, that we looked at my case, didn't understand the filings, and wrote an embarrassing motion that would put the judge in a bad place and annoy her. I can tell you, the judge didn't seem annoyed when she talked about this.
No, she indicated that she was going to rule in our favor.
Yes, because not only that, we only asked for a few documents, a few of the more recent documents that had been improperly sealed.
Basically, they weren't sealed. I mean, they just have not been released to the public. They're supposed to be sealed via a motion, requesting sealing, but these are, not, no one's asking them to be sealed, but yet they are not being made available on my case.
And so she's indicating that that is an error. And is an error not just in the documents that we specified, but in many other earlier documents. So sometime next week, all of those documents will be made available to the public. So it's not going to be available just to Anya and I. It's going to be available to everyone listening. And this is, of course, because of the motion we filed. And
let's just address the first two things that we always get when we talk about documents and reporting on cases. No, it's not going to hurt the case. The judge is not going to do something that is going to hurt the case. This is a esteemed judge who is well known in Indiana, has a ton of legal experience. We didn't trick her. This is not going to destroy the case against Richard Allen or do anything to that effect. To suggest that is to reveal a stunning ignorance of the law and how it works, first of all. And then second of all, was this just were we just like filing onto some media interveners thing? No, this was just us. We did this alone. This was just us as journalists and private citizens coming forward who want to know more about this case and want things to be done in a proper way. So it was gratifying to hear that the court basically looked on that with favor, because I think it's an indication that, there's like a kind of a weird phenomenon I've seen in coverage of the Delphi case, especially in more online circles. And it's like people would rather like play pretend games in the sandbox with their imagination than actually seek to get actual information, and information that they should be able to access, because that's how our system works. And I think if there was more focus on things like, filing document requests and asking questions and figuring out what more we could introduce on the record, that would be a better situation.
This is how journalism works. And so, as we said, because of this motion we filed, and we filed it by ourselves, no one joined us. Because of this motion, we all next week will be getting a lot more information about this case. It would be made available to everyone, but hopefully you will at least consider coming here and hearing our analysis of it, since it's only becoming available because of us.
And we just want to say again, it's very gratifying to have the court react favorably. We didn't know what to expect, but we were hopeful that the merits of this would be seen, and it sounds like that's what happened.
And before we leave this, I'd just like, hopefully people understand that Anya and I put a lot of thought into things before we do them.
Yeah.
Filing this was not a sudden whim, as some people seem to think. It was not because we misunderstood something on my case. It was because we looked at it thoroughly, thought about it, and became convinced that a mistake was occurring.
And I mean, people who may talk to us behind the scenes on the case, they know that, because we've been talking about doing something and filing some sort of motion around this for a while. It's something you want to vet. We've talked to people who were helpful to us and steered us in different directions on how to do this and what to look for. And
we talked to a lot of people in this case.
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, I think because so much coverage of this case is just people, like, again, using their imaginations about what sounds good to me right now. There's this perception that that's what we do too. No, we talk to people behind the scenes. That's journalism. We're not. There's not a lot that surprises us in this case anymore. And that's because you call people, you bother people, you show up, you look into backgrounds, you look into research, and you just kind of dig, and that's how we cover this case, and that's how we're able to kind of have a sense and be able to either give you reporting or scoops or just context that can help you understand things, because it's a lot of work. It's not just kind of watching things on the outside. It's not an outsider's perspective.
And if we don't feel like we can reveal everything at once, we try to at least hint. As we hinted yesterday that something big was going to happen today.
Yeah, we don't. I mean, I would prefer to just come out and say things because that would be more interesting and frankly, it would be better. But at the same time, we want to balance that with not we have certain responsibilities to either sources and just our feelings on this case is we care about justice for Libby and Abby, and we're not trying to make anything into a stupid circus of putting scoops above all else at this point.
So yeah, jumping ahead a bit, we understood yesterday that there was a strong chance that the information about the confessions would come out today. It wasn't a sure thing. And we didn't feel it was appropriate for us to go on the podcast and say, guess what? There was some confessions. And then the next day, nothing be said about them.
Yeah,
we thought it was appropriate for that first to be mentioned in court.
Yeah, I did. I just felt like, on the one hand, prejudicing things against Richard Allen, that's not fair. He has rights. And then on the other hand, I mean, if that's something that the prosecution doesn't want out there for some reason, perhaps, there's some sort of strategy there. Either way, it just felt kind of slimy to try to be just running with that on the eve of, a pretrial hearing. And yeah, we're just. Again, the scoop is significantly less important to us at this time than just trying to be stewards of, reporting on this case in a responsible way.
So after the judge announced that these documents would be made available next week, which was an announcement that I think probably pleases you as much as it pleases us because it's good to get more information out there, she then made an announcement that I think probably disappointed a lot of people, which was that the suppression hearing scheduled today was being postponed and that today would instead focus on the due process motion to reconsider. And this all revolves around the motion that Attorney Brad Rosie filed back in April. This is the motion I'm sure you all remember where he talked about the conditions that Richard Allen was allegedly being kept in at Westville. Being kept in a room smaller than a dog kennel, being kept like a prisoner of war. So,
can I just say before we get into that, I think from judging from social media and from some of the chatter outside the courthouse, I think a lot of people were really here for the suppression hearing. And that's understandable. There was going to be potentially discussion of ballistics evidence. We all want to hear what's going to go on with that. What's the defense going to say? Why shouldn't this be introduced? But because we had a sense about the confessions, we were really more interested in the due process, I think. So I think when we heard suppression is canceled, but due process isn't, we were like, oh, thank God. Because we already hinted at this on the show last night, and that would be pretty awkward. We had a pretty decent feeling that was going to happen, though. That's why we did that.
And so the bulk of the day was spent discussing the issue of Allen's treatment at Westville and whether or not it was appropriate treatment and whether he should be moved. The first speaker on that was Brad Rosie.
Yes, Allen's defense attorney.
He started talking about the Safekeeping Act, which he said basically means he said the Safekeeping Act can only be invoked if there is an imminent danger of harm to a prisoner.
Why don't we explain what that means in the context of...
Right. So it can only be invoked if there is imminent danger of harm to a prisoner. And if there is imminent danger of harm to a prisoner and it's invoked, that means a prisoner can be moved to a different location.
Right. So this has to do with incarceration before a trial.
Yes. And of course, back in October, after Allen was arrested, then Sheriff Tobe Lazenby filed a motion on safekeeping, saying it's too dangerous, basically, to have Richard Allen in the Carroll County Jail. He needs to go somewhere else. And that's how he ended up at Westville. And Rosie was saying this can only be invoked if there's actual provable danger to the inmate.
And yes, and of course, remember, Carroll County, a very small county, I think slightly over maximum capacity for their jail is like a bit over 30. So that's very, very small. Westville is under the Indiana Department of Correction. It is a prison. It's mostly, unilaterally people have been convicted and sent there.
Right.
In fact, we learned at this hearing that it's pretty unprecedented for a pre-trial detainee to be there in the first place. The murder sheet keeps us busy. At one recent court hearing, we were running around observing, gathering information, and reporting from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. Because of all that, it's hard to find time to secure quality ingredients and cook fine meals at home.
Thankfully, HelloFresh has our backs. Our terrific sponsor is America's #1 meal kit for a reason. This service combines convenience, value, and deliciousness, and ensures that you and your family are enjoying home-cooked, quality meals without the hassle.
Recently, Kevin and I got to put our heads together over something other than script writing. It was so fun to cook together. It was also quite easy. The ingredients are perfectly portioned, so there's no food waste. The instructions are also foolproof, which is lucky for us because we are fools in the kitchen.
We prepared beef bulgogi meatballs with roasted carrots, ginger rice, and sriracha sauce. It was delicious. The meatballs were flavorful and the rice was perfectly fluffy.
We're pretty used to just grabbing cheap fast food when we're on the road, so some nutritional heft and diversity of cuisine has been really nice. You never have to worry about getting tired of anything, because there's something for everyone. Go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet16 and use code MSheet16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet16 and use code MSheet16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. So these are very different places. We've interviewed people who've spent time in both, and we'll link to some of that in our show notes so you can kind of refresh yourself on that. But, I mean, basically, these are kind of worlds apart as far as incarceration goes.
And to go back to that original motion, basically, Lazenby said we don't have the manpower to take care of him, and we are concerned that he might come to harm.
Basically, this is a very high-profile case. It is a high-profile case against 2 children, and means a lot to the local community. So if you put a guy in jail and you have somebody who wants to do violence to them and there's limited manpower and it's like, basically there could be a bad situation there.
And Rosie made a big deal out of the fact that the judge who was then presiding over this case, Judge Benjamin Diener, he granted Tobe Lazenby's motion without taking any evidence. So basically, Tobe Lazenby said, we feel there's a danger here, and he didn't provide any evidence or spell out what exactly that danger was, but Diener granted the request anyway, and Rosie was arguing that wasn't appropriate.
Here's where we get to the part that to us was maybe the most important moment in this entire thing, and it's basically that Brad Rosie drops in his own, kind of speech before the court that Richard Allen has potentially made incriminating statements about the Delphi murders while incarcerated in Westville.
Yes, he mentioned this in his opening remarks about the safekeeping statute.
Yes. So, first of all, very smart move by Rosie. Some of you may be thinking, why would he even mention that? But for reasons that we can get into later, this is very likely going to come up in trial, first of all. And being the first one to spin something is often a bit of a power move, because then you're basically kind of putting your own mark on it and like being more dismissive. And frankly, it seemed to work, because a lot of the people we talked to in the recess to this trial didn't even seem to fully understand how significant that statement was.
Yeah, I was surprised.
I was shocked.
We knew that this was coming. And we thought, well, when something is said about Richard Allen implicating himself in this crime, people are going to gasp. There's going to be a stir. But Attorney Brad Rosie mentions it, and there's no reaction.
And it's not, we're not making a statement about whether, we're not making a statement on guilt or innocence. You could say, well, it may have happened and it's just a sign of his deteriorating mental state. You can say, well, that means he's guilty. Either way, it's a significant fact. That's all we're saying, and it attracts your notice, and you want to know more about that.
And it's something that's going to have to be dealt with one way or the other before this case has final resolution.
Yes. And I was really shocked. I was just shocked. I mean, some people seem to get it, how big that is. Others did not. I think one problem with this hearing in general was more on the technical side. I think a lot of people couldn't hear what was being said on the stand or even by Brad Rosie. The microphone that's on the stand is basically going to the court recorder, essentially.
It doesn't amplify sound.
No, it doesn't amplify sound at all. And it's also a situation where, Brad, Rosie, and the different attorneys are facing the opposite way. So I wonder if there may have just been more of like people didn't quite hear it, so they didn't really know what to make of it situation there.
Yeah, because when we came out for a recess later, it seemed to be causing a big stir online while people actually there
we're just like,
didn't really seem to understand.
Confessed. Oh, yeah. It's like, that's a really big deal, guys.
And it first came up, as we say, when Brad Rosie kind of just throws it in the middle of his argument almost randomly. And he says, but the real issue is we want to represent our client well. We need access to him, and this is really a bad situation.
Yeah, he's trying to detonate it like in a controlled, neutral setting. So that's what I think that makes sense that he would bring it up strategically, just because you're basically being like, hey, guys, we're admitting it, but it's not a big deal.
Then prosecutor Nick McClelland stands up. And before we talk about what he said, I want to quickly make the point that Nick McClelland did a great job today.
Nick McClelland really brought his A game. I felt just like he seemed very sharp on the ball with these responses, and he was just like relentless. I mean, I was really... I don't know if we've seen this entire side of Nick McClelland before in the courtroom. Then again, most of the court proceedings we've had so far have been very short. But, it was sort of Brad Rosie has this kind of fiery style. In one of our profile episodes, someone described him as a bit of a pit bull. You saw that here. So we expected that. But Nick McClelland was very much on things. I don't know. I mean, it was really...
He was very impressive.
It was very impressive. Like, I was really... like, wow.
He stands up and he says, of course, the state's primary role here, our primary concern is to protect Richard Allen before the trial. And then he just says, and the fact that Richard Allen has made multiple confessions to this crime, multiple admissions to this crime.
To multiple people.
That puts him at more risk because the more people in prison who believe that he is guilty and that he's going around confessing to it, this might make people angrier and upset with someone who's done violence against children. It might make him a target of assault in prison.
And first of all, from speaking with people, former inmates, we know that people who attack, kill, molest children are in fact the lowest of the low in a prison culture. Those are the people who get killed. Those are the people who get attacked. So that is based on a real phenomenon. And in addition to that, he's also, he's using basically the fact that, basically the confessions or these kind of incriminating statements are in play at this hearing. He's using it as he's kind of hammering at it. He's saying, 5 to 6 times that these confessions happened, apparently.
He's bringing the confessions in to make the argument basically for why Allen needs to be in a more secure location.
And basically, like, as more information comes out, as we get closer to trial, as more hearings happen, as more filings happen, it's not going to get better for him. His risk level is going to go up because there's going to be pre-trial publicity. There's going to be, people feeling that he's just guilty and then going maybe and wanting to hurt him because of that. And so that's where it's coming in. And yeah, it was really interesting to see some of the back and forth today between because essentially both sides got to call witnesses to support their points. And so you had basically like cross-examination, people going back and forth. You had some very snappy lines between feisty witnesses and salty attorneys. I mean, like, it was really, there were points where I was like on the edge of my seat because I was just like, it was so intense at some points.
Let's talk about some of these witnesses.
Yeah.
The defense got to call their witnesses first. And first of all, let me say that the attorney who carried the ball on the defense side today was Brad Rosie.
Yes.
So he's handling this.
And to be clear, I think there's always going to be, in a situation like this, Baldwin is going to have different tasks. Like it's not like they are going to be like splitting up everything evenly at every hearing.
Right.
So it's not surprising to see, I just think there's a division of labor between them, and that sort of Baldwin, for his part, as usual, seems to be at the hearings. He's kind of has his arm protectively around Richard Allen, who is, of course, all chained up and in between Rosie and Baldwin. So he's more of talking to Allen's family, who was there at this hearing.
Should we talk a little bit about that before we go into the witnesses?
Yeah, I think we should. Kathy Allen was there, sitting in our row as usual. We understand that Allen's mother was also there.
Yeah.
And so his family continuing to show up in support of him, talking with Andy Baldwin, kind of.
How would you describe Richard Allen today?
He's in a yellow prison jumpsuit. He's wearing some sort of like ballistics vest, and he has his hands chained in front of him, one hand over the other. There's like a chain around his waist. He's chained up. He's kind of gotten, as we've seen him, I mean, his eyes have almost like, I don't say this in any sort of denigrating way. Please keep in mind, I'm just trying to be descriptive of what I noticed. It's almost kind of like a scared animal. Like not like somebody looking out of like, oh man, like this, I'm in court, this is bad. But like it's just very raw, visceral sort of fear or kind of like uncertainty. He looked bad.
He looked to me to be at times almost dazed. I was really struck in the past when he came out and was led out past his wife. There would typically be some sort of interaction.
Yeah, like, I love you, mouthing, I love you.
This time, there was a blank look in his eye. He didn't even seem to acknowledge her.
Yes.
Didn't even seem to realize she was there.
And I guess to me, it's like that kind of goes either way, because you have a situation where, could guilt over doing something horrible kind of make you just lose it. Yeah, I could see that. Could being innocent in a horrible situation make you lose it? Yeah, I could see that. To me, all the things about like his body language or what he was doing, it's interesting to observe, but it's not something that's going to make me think guilt or innocence necessarily, unless someone's acting in a really egregiously obnoxious way. But he was not. He just seemed scared, and he's definitely skinny, has more of a sunken, look to his face at this point. So he's definitely changed a lot over the course of us observing him. But of course, we've only started observing him from when he was, first incarcerated.
Should we go to Tobe?
Let's go to Tobe Lazenby.
First witness, Tobe Lazenby. Do you want to start?
So he's the former sheriff of Carroll County. He's now the chief deputy of Carroll County. And he's basically being called by Brad Rosie to discuss, how did this safekeeping order come about?
Brad Rosie really made a big deal out of the fact that apparently Tobe Lazenby drafted some sort of motion for a safekeeping order and showed it to Judge Diener, and Judge Diener had him change some of the wording in it.
Right.
And Brad Rosie tried to make something significant out of that. Tobe Lazenby maintained that even if some of the wording was changed, all of the facts in it were true as far as Tobe was concerned.
Yes. And in addition to that, just one thing that Brad Rosie was seemingly trying to make a very big deal about was like, okay, well, why did you need to do this? Were there any actual threats to Richard Allen that you were getting that made you feel you couldn't take care of him? And Tobe's response was really more of like, this is a proactive measure. We were not getting emails or people coming in and saying they were going to kill him. It's more of like the setting is such that we felt that it would be irresponsible for us to take that on.
And keep in mind, Brad Rosie has said that his interpretation of the law is that if there's not actual provable threats, then this can't be invoked and it shouldn't have been moved. So Tobe Lazenby is saying there were not actual provable threats, but just from my experience of the way things work and knowing how small the jail here is in Carroll County, I just didn't think it would be practical. And I thought we didn't have the manpower to handle it, and we couldn't guarantee his safety. And
I'll just say this, like, I can kind of, I think the law is the law, right? The law is the law, and it needs to be, followed. And so from that perspective, what I'm about to say doesn't really superimpose, doesn't change that. But I can also, I can see what he was saying in terms of like, if you basically have a tiny jail, tiny staff or understaffed, can't really, keep an eye on someone who might be a high profile target for some, hothead in your jail. I could see why you would probably not want to deal with that, or maybe even feel that it would be responsible to kind of hold up your hands and say, whoa, we're not ready for this. We're a small, poor county, and we do not have the ability to do this. And that could get this person killed when he's supposed to be being kept safe in anticipation of his trial. So, I mean, I think before we had the defense side of things about, he's moved to Westville and his rights are being violated, which we got and we've covered. But I think this was an opportunity to really hear the other side of it. So I was glad to have that because I felt like we were missing that before. And I saw some of those points. And I think even the defense conceded some of those points in like later, at a later time.
Right. He also got Tobe to concede that one of the goals of the sheriff's department is to make sure that all prisoners are treated equally before the trial. And then he asked former Sheriff Lazenby a series of questions to establish the fact, well, if you're in Carroll County Jail, it's relatively easy for an attorney to come and visit. And the meetings happen in a large, comfortable room. The attorney can come and talk with their client pretty easily. And the prisoners at these meetings are not shackled or chained. And, then he showed Tobe Lazenby, the famous pictures of, the famous picture that Andy Baldwin took of Richard Allen that was included in the motion to modify the safekeeping order. And Tobe Lazenby said, well, we would not have an inmate in Carroll County wearing clothes that were that dirty. So basically, he got Tobe Lazenby to say, well, if our goal is for these people to be treated equally under the law, it looks like Richard Allen is not being treated as well at Westville as he would be at Carroll County.
Right.
And then Nick McClelland stands up to do cross-examination.
Yes. So basically he got Tobe Lazenby to talk more about the, the danger that Allen could be in or the retribution that could take place in a jail. And, some of the struggles that the county has had with manpower.
Yeah, and he said Carroll County, maybe it's easy to see your clients there. They're mostly low-level crimes. Carroll County, they don't have a special segregated unit for specific inmates. So Richard Allen would have to be housed with other inmates who could potentially harm him. And so he's trying to bring up some reasons why,
also noting how some things would actually be similar in Carroll County to Westville. One point that's going to come up a lot is the fact, the idea of Allen being videotaped, right? Videotaped while incarcerated. And, McClelland is asking Lazenby questions about he'd be videotaped in Carroll County Jail too, right? Yes. I mean, so basically trying to draw some commonalities to indicate that Carroll County really wouldn't be suitable. And in some ways that the defense is sort of honing in on would be exactly the same.
And then there's redirect examination by Attorney Brad Rosie. He says, well, basically you say you don't have a lot of manpower, but, United State Police has been pretty helpful to you. Don't you think if you called and asked them, they might be willing to help out?
Yeah, he said the state police have been intimately involved in this case for the last 5 or 6 years. Why not bring them in? So he's alluding to the fact that state police have been very much involved in this case. Basically, why don't you get them to do things for you? Get them to help you house him somewhere else. One thing, I don't know if this came up in this portion, but I think it's important to establish now. One thing that we found out is that even if Allen is transferred to let's say, Marion County, he's not going to be, but let's say he's transferred to Cass County, wherever he's transferred. It's still Carroll County's responsibility to move him around, and ultimately the fallout is on them if something happens to him. They can't just wash their hands of him. So that's one thing that kind of McClellan seemed to be kind of indicating and making it clear. And also,
right now, the responsibility for transport is from the Indiana Department of Corrections. But if he goes to a county jail, it's going to fall on Carroll County.
Yes, it basically reverts to Carroll County having to do that. And one thing that we found out from this is that, Carroll County is so strapped as far as manpower goes that sheriffs, the actual sheriff of the county, have to participate in prisoner transport because otherwise they just don't have enough people to do it. So that's kind of striking.
So then there was a cross-examination by Nick McClellan. He said, would you have concerns today, safety concerns, if Richard Allen was placed in the Carroll County jail? And Tobe Lazenby said, yes, I'm really concerned about harm that could be caused by other inmates. And Nick McClellan took this opportunity to, again, make the point, well, yeah, he's especially vulnerable to harm since he has admitted to the crimes. McClellan really was working that detail in any chance he got.
Yeah, Brad Rosie did the smart thing by kind of alluding to it in a vague and, kind of whatever way. But McClellan was not going to let him get away with that without also, harping on it himself, because it's that's a good fact for him, frankly. So the next witness is Max Baker. This is a young man who is interning with Brad Rosie. He's interested in becoming a lawyer in the future, so this is a great opportunity for him to sort of watch how a prominent local attorney works and kind of get some of that experience. And so Brad Rosie calls him. Max Baker's role in this is to give a sense, an insider's perspective on what it's been like for the defense team to access Richard Allen these past months, and also speak to the mental deterioration they say they have observed in him over time.
And basically he did that by telling the story of he actually accompanied attorney Brad Rosie and sometimes other people on visits to Westville to see Richard Allen on 4 different occasions. The first time was roughly around Christmas 2022, and the other 3 times were in May.
Yes. And basically he spoke to a situation where I think the defense's point was, there's inconsistent standards. When they first showed up, everybody was pretty helpful and they let them in with computers and phones, and, they kind of set everything up nice for them. And then in subsequent visits, they did not. And that they made them meet in a small room and all sorts of things happened. We can get more into what they're alleging happened as well. But the point is basically it's inconsistent, it's inconvenient, it's not good for our client. Also, can I just say, when he said that he left his wallet in the car when he showed up the first time, but they kind of still let him in. I mean, that was relatable for me. People were laughing about that behind us, but I was like, that is something I would absolutely do. So, and you know me, Kevin. So
I do know you.
You know what the nightmare that living with me is. So, that's true. Anyways, but yeah, he's kind of coming into this as a kind of a person, a fly on the wall for the defense.
And not only did he say that it was more difficult, the process of visiting Richard Allen as time went by, he also spoke about a kind of a deterioration in Richard Allen. And apparently the 4th visit of the 4 was in late May.
May 30th.
May 30th, and it included Kathy Allen. And they made a big deal out of the fact that at some point during this visit, Richard Allen asked someone for water and wasn't given water. And that was a detail that Brad Rosie would come back to again and again throughout the day, is a sign of this is how bad things are. This is how badly he's treated. He can't even get water when he asks for it.
Yes. Also, again, showing a consistent theme, Kathy Allen continuing to visit, continuing to show up for hearings.
Didn't they say this was the first time she visited?
Oh, yeah. This is the first time she visited, but she's been there for her husband throughout this process. I think that's what we've observed. That's what I'm trying to stress.
One thing that was especially interesting to me in the stories about the visits to see Richard Allen was on one of these visits, Richard Allen was closely followed by someone with what Brad Rosie and Max described as an old-fashioned camcorder. They were recording his every move. And then the meeting with the attorneys was held in a smallish room with a big window, and the camcorder ended up being put on the other side of the window, focused in on Richard Allen for the entire course of the meeting. And Attorney Rosie indicated he found that invasive and a threat to the sanctity of the attorney-client privilege.
Now, let's talk about that for a moment, because attorney-client privilege is very, very important to our legal system. One thing I learned through this hearing is that my understanding, and we're going to hear from even more people associated with, different jails and prisons, but I did not realize that it was actually seemingly standard practice for there to be some filming going on in regards to attorney-client meetings, but I guess the standard is no sound. Has to be visual only, and there are certain standards. They don't, you shouldn't be able to zoom and read lips. It should just be basically, my understanding is if the inmate attacks an attorney, they want to have that on videotape, essentially. Right. So I didn't even know that was a thing. I would have figured you couldn't film anything in any way, but that's not the case. But still, the detail about the camcorder is pretty weird.
And we'll hear more about that later, including a possible explanation.
Yes, we will. But it was it was definitely striking when Brad Rosie brought it up. No, I think one thing I think we can get into a little bit more later. I thought Max did a fine job on the stand. I think, a lot of what Brad Rosie described was shocking, but I think there's a bit of a kind of risk where I think when you're lumping so many details in together, my question was, and having spoken to some people who were incarcerated at Westville and did have experiences in the maximum control unit, it kind of becomes is this a Richard Allen problem, or is this a Westville problem? Or is this just a problem with being incarcerated in general? And so it can be a little bit, I think, going through so many things, it became a little bit hard to kind of tell between what's what should we be really shocked by, what maybe is more of that's a problem with prisons and it's not being targeted at him. So that was just a thought that came to my head.
I think that's an excellent point. The cross-examination of Max was relatively mild. The key thing was, I believe Nick McClellan said, you indicate that when you see Richard Allen recently, he's not normal, but you didn't know him before he was arrested, so are you really able to tell what normal is for Richard Allen?
Yeah, which was that's a fair point.
And then on redirect, Brad Rosie showed Max a photo of Richard Allen taken before his arrest. Again, I believe this was the photo that appeared in the motion to modify the safekeeping order. And he said, did he look like this when you saw him? And Max said, no.
Yes, Max is saying, I think he looks worse, essentially. He's deteriorated.
And then Rosie further had Max say, you visited other murderers with me, or other accused murderers in prisons and jails, and have we ever had to jump through as many hoops and hurdles as when we visited Richard Allen? And basically, Max said no.
Yeah. And one thing I thought the prosecution kept hammering that I don't necessarily feel I think it's emotionally incredibly compelling. I don't know that I find it legally compelling, is just this is the murder of two girls. And I get that on a fundamental level because, you and I have spent so much time on this case, and I think we've developed a sense that we care deeply about the outcome, and we care about what happens to justice for Libby and Abby. We care about what happens to the people in this community, the families and their friends, and there's just been this horrible loss. So I think we feel that on an emotional side of things, but at the end of the day, murders are murders, and when the prosecution is saying, hey, this will be perceived differently by other inmates because it's against children, that is a very fair point. But when it's we don't want to get into the area where it's people should be treated differently because it's a more high profile case.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So next witness. This was the hardest to hear witness in the entire thing. I barely caught any of this. It was very difficult to hear this man.
It really was.
And this is, of course, Captain Gary Lewis of the Department of Correction. So this is a long-term captain. He's been at, I think, Westville at the maximum control unit for 4 years. And he's like a leader in the team there. He was very, very soft-spoken, so at times it was very hard to hear what he was saying. He also seemed to me like one of the more nervous witnesses, in my view. Obviously, that's subjective.
I think the key thing I took from his testimony, from what I could hear of it, he spoke of the system of using so-called companions to monitor certain prisoners.
And this is great because when we talk to our sources who were once inmates, they told us this. So we've reported this a while ago.
Yeah, this is if someone is on like some kind of suicide watch, they'll often have other inmates basically stand outside their door, sit outside the door, and keep an eye on them.
Yeah. And basically, I think Rosie's point was that's not really professional. How can you trust a bunch of felons? It's so funny hearing defense attorneys talk about like felons and the worst criminals possible. Because you're like, it's just like, yeah, my client's not like those other clients. It's just funny. Like they're disparaging other people in the prison. It's like, okay. But I think his point was basically like, are these guys trustworthy? And like, if they're interacting with my client or saying bad things, like that doesn't seem like a good system, or like telling other inmates things. So, I mean, I saw his point there. And basically, I believe in this section, it was revealed that since, in whatever time period has passed, I guess Alan now has basically a guard posted outside. So an employee of DOC rather than one of these inmate companions.
Yeah, and then in cross-examination from Nick, what I took from that is Nick got Captain Lewis to say that Richard Allen is not being treated any differently from the other people.
Yes.
And he's actually being treated identical to the others.
Yes.
And then there was some redirect, some basic questions where Brad Rosie said, we know the other people there are murderers and child molesters. They're the worst of the worst, while my client is still a pre-trial detainee. He's not been found guilty of anything. Which is
fair. I believe he also asked the captain, like, is it common for pre-trial detainees to be in MCU or Westville in general? And he was like, I mean,
no.
No. The answer is no.
And then there was an interesting thing. I thought that Brad Rosie was done asking questions, but he conferred with Andrew Baldwin, and then he asked, can you confirm that a man named Robert Baston is in the same unit as Richard Allen? And Captain Lewis confirmed it, and that was the end of it. So let's put a pin in the name Robert Baston.
Yes, let's. Next witness?
Next witness.
All right. So the next one is yet another. Well, this is the sheriff of Cass County, Edward Schroeder.
I'm sure you remember that in the motion to modify the safekeeping order, Rosie said that the sheriff of Cass County, this gentleman, had indicated he would be able to take Richard Allen to the Cass County jail.
So this is the kind of famous Cass County example of like, why don't we just take him to Cass County? And we'd been very curious about this because, if the sheriff is offering, bring him here, then, that seems pretty compelling. Although I think we learned some things that maybe may add a few wrinkles to that.
Why don't you go over his testimony?
This is the quote that I wrote down from Schroeder. This is how he reacted to the proposal that Allen be brought there. I really don't want him. Basically, he doesn't want the headache. He does not want to deal with this. But if I'm ordered by a judge to take him, then he will. So
he said, I'm willing to do it. If ordered, it will be a headache.
Yeah, he doesn't want to do it. This was not like bring him over, no problem. This is like hypothetically, if a judge told me I had to, then sure.
He also, under Brad Rosie's questioning, he said the jail is big. It's big enough to house violent offenders safely. He said it's very, very easy to arrange attorney-client visits. And unlike Westville, the client would only be shackled if he had threatened someone who had acted violently. And also, unlike Westville, you don't need a lot of advance notice to set up attorney-client privileges. He said basically, if you're Brad Rosie's office is across the street from the jail. If Brad Rosie gets sitting in his office, says, "Oh, I'd like to see my client," basically 15 minutes later, he can be talking to Richard Allen.
There you go. So Brad Rosie's using this as an opportunity to highlight all the conveniences of his alternative plan and, basically indicate, why don't we do this?
And then Nick McClelland stood up and did some cross-examination. And my impression of this was Nick wanted to establish that if Richard Allen was transferred to Cass County Jail, his living conditions would not be significantly different than what he's experiencing in Westville.
Yeah, and he even noted that in some cases, essentially, one thing that came out in this hearing, I don't know if it came out here, but it came out overall, is that Richard Allen is currently under suicide watch. And that if he were under suicide watch at Cass County, he couldn't have any visits. That would, not, no contact, essentially. So he was kind of highlighting areas where, it would be worse. And one thing that really came through was basically, you're saying this man is having mental health struggles, he's deteriorating. I think one thing McClelland was really trying to do is essentially establish that Cass County has fewer resources as far as mental health goes. They have some sort of third-party partnership with a vendor, but it's not necessarily the same thing as having full-time staff there. So he was trying to underscore actually what you're asking for is worse based on what you're saying. And I think he made some effective points.
I think he did. And he also got the sheriff of Cass County to agree that if an offender's crime involves harm to children, then there is possibility of retaliation. And the sheriff said, based on my experience, that's certainly true.
I just wonder if Sheriff Schroeder was annoyed to be dragged into this. I don't want to have this headache. Everyone's doing a joust around me to get me to take this guy, but I don't want it. So I don't know. It was just kind of interesting because you almost got the sense from the filing, he'd be happy to take him. Obviously it's more complicated than that, but at the same time, you do understand where Brad Rosie's coming from because he is literally a half a block away from the jail. So the whole issue of him driving a long way to get to Allen and Westville would be taken care of readily.
And this was the last of the defense witnesses.
Yeah.
And so this was when there was the lunch recess. After the lunch recess, Nick McClelland presented two witnesses.
Yes.
Who was the first?
The first was Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett. This is a man who is not just the current sheriff of the county. He is one of the lead investigators on the case for the county. And actually, that was one of the first things, that kind of eventually Brad Rosie would ask him about. But anyways, he worked this case relatively early on. And basically, it's one of those cases that I think basically, I don't think there's a lead investigator per se, but there are lead investigators representing different, agencies. And so as far as Carroll County goes, he's very important to the Delphi case.
And that is certainly true. And Sheriff Liggett very early on made a point very similar to what we've been hearing earlier, which is that he would be that if Richard Allen is incarcerated at Carroll County Jail, he would be concerned for his safety from other inmates because the offense involves harm to children. And Nick McClelland, amplifies that. He says, and that threat is only going to grow as more and more information gets out about this. And Nick said, we've heard information today. There have been confessions. He's confessed 5 or 6 times.
I was we were both, I think, looking at each other at that moment, just oh my God.
Nick was really working hard.
That was fiery. And also then at that point, Rosie's objecting. So we're actually seeing an objection. And you may have heard this better than I, but I think Gull said something to the effect of the rules of evidence don't apply. And she overruled it.
Yeah.
So basically they kind of introduced this issue. And again, Rosie knows he's going to have to deal with the confessions one way or another. So doing it this way makes sense. But again, McClellan's not like ceding ground on like not bringing it up now that's been brought up.
He is going to bring it up. He brought it up today every chance he could.
Man, I was like, wow.
Like a dog with a bone.
Yeah, it was impressive. I really felt his performance. I think we said this, but I thought it was an impressive performance in court today. And it was just it felt like a real even match. It felt like a match between, two sides that were prepared and ready to, argue their claims. And so it was like very much back and forth. It was not like one side dominating.
And then I want to highlight two moments that stood out to me in the cross-examination of Liggett when Rosie started.
Before we go, I just want this came up, but like just to underscore how apparently badly staffed Carroll County Sheriff's Office is. Liggett is just back from Kentucky where he just dropped off a prisoner, so he's the sheriff and he's doing that. So like they're trying to underscore like we're not able to transport people, run people around, and we don't really feel like we have the staff in the jail to really protect, like have a high risk person like this come in.
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah. And also the transport situation is going to become important in a moment.
So in the cross-examination, there's two moments. The first that came to mind is when Rosie was asking Lazenby questions. He was saying, you say you want to make sure that a pretrial detainee gets good treatment. Did you ever go to Westville to supervise for yourself what kind of treatment Alan was getting? And of course, Lazenby said no. And he said the reason he didn't bother to make the trip was not because he was lazy or didn't care about conditions, but because he trusts the Indiana Department of Corrections.
You mean Liggett?
No, this is Lazenby.
Oh, you were talking previously. Okay,
yes.
Yeah.
So he asked Lazenby that question. That was Lazenby's answer. And so then he asked Liggett the question, did you ever go to Westville to see the conditions Alan is kept under? And Liggett gave an answer that surprised Brad Rosie. Surprised me too, frankly. I think it surprised a lot of people in the courtroom. He said, yes, I have been to Westville. I went there to try to interview Richard Allen. And from the looks on the faces of the defense attorneys, it was pretty clear that this was the first they were hearing about this interview. And of course, it's a big no-no to interview prisoners without attorneys present. In fairness, Liggett said the interview he went there to conduct with Richard Allen didn't happen. But the surprise at the defense table was apparent. So
would that have any bad repercussions for the prosecution if it maybe tried to do something that's not approved of, but it didn't happen? Or is it hard to say?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say what the consequences would be.
I guess we don't know the circumstances either.
And if there was no interview, if they did an interview under improper circumstances, maybe the fruits of that interview would be suppressed. But if the interview never happened...
Yeah, there's nothing to suppress.
Right.
And we know that that's not where these confessions happened because it didn't happen. But that was an interesting moment. And kind of makes you wonder what the circumstances of that were. Like, I mean, could Alan have reached out to Liggett or something? I mean, like, hey, come up here. I want to tell you everything. And then... Liggett's like, okay, and then I just don't even know. How does a thing like that happen? I don't know.
And I don't think the defense attorneys had any idea this happened. The other moment I want to highlight is Brad Rosie says to Tony Liggett, you were the lead investigator on this. You signed off on the decision to arrest this man. Doesn't that mean you sort of have a vested interest in his conviction? And, Liggett kind of agreed to that. And so Rosie said, considering that, is it okay for you, the person who has this vested interest, to also be in charge of his pre-detention care? And Liggett said, well, that's what I was elected to do.
That was a solid answer. And that was a quick answer. I thought Liggett performed well on the stand for the most part with that shocking revelation about Westville out of the picture. I would say, though, that, I felt like that was a bit of the defense trying to have their cake and eat it, too, because, which is it? Do you want him to be released into a jail where ultimately Carroll County will have a large say over what's going on with him, which means that Tony Liggett will have a large say over what's going on with him, or do you want him to remain in Westville, or is there some other alternative situation that could be good here? I don't know, but it just seemed like a bit like, and one thing I felt they were doing that was interesting. I mean, at the one hand, it's like, oh, the ISP, Indiana State Police are all over this case. They're intimately involved. But then they're hammering Tony Liggett for being the lead investigator. So it's I really think this was more of a team effort with Delphi. I think there were people from different agencies working pretty hard on it. So I don't feel, I mean, I think they want a certain, subset of people to kind of run away and be like, Tony Liggett, the lead investigator. And I don't really feel like that's an accurate characterization. I think he was an important part of that team. So their point stands, but the way they emphasized it, I think, is probably overstating it. That's just my take. Actually, no, I know that for a fact. That's an overstatement. That's a generalization.
In conversation between us afterwards, I think we agreed that Nick McClelland's second and final witness was probably the strongest witness of the day. Who was that?
I don't even. How do you say his name?
This was the warden of Westville. John Galpo, I believe.
This guy was unflappable. Just ice cold.
Ice cold.
Yeah, I wish I came across this way, but it's just nothing phases this guy. And he and Rosie were going back and forth, and Rosie is bringing the fire.
First, it's
McClelland.
First is direct examination from McClelland, and this basically, I think one thing we've complained about, frankly, in the past is that the defense in this case filed the motion to modify safekeeping, where they made all sorts of allegations about how Richard Allen was being treated, and we never got to hear the prosecution's response to that motion because it was sealed.
And we were with the gag order, you're essentially letting Carroll County Sheriff's Office take a fall for this because they're getting blamed and they're not able to defend themselves, and you're not defending them publicly yet.
And you're also letting the people who run Westville take the fall for this.
Yeah, it kind of just it was a bad situation.
So we got the response basically today from the warden.
And did we?
So he started out by going through the conditions. He says Allen is in a segregated cell for his safety, even though no threats have been made. The cell has a 24-hour surveillance camera. The cell is 12 foot by 8.5 foot. He's currently on suicide watch. I should mention that the 24-hour surveillance is from a camera that's video only, no audio.
It's no audio.
He mentions that there's a toilet in the cell. There's no limit on toilet paper. There's a bed. The bed is not just a mattress.
It's bolted to the ground in order to...
A bed frame is bolted to the...
Yeah, to be less easy to use in a suicide attempt.
Richard Allen gets fresh clothes. He also has made some commissary purchases of other clothing items.
Specifically socks, shirts. He basically, he has a lot of fresh clothes. He has access to an electronic tablet that's powered through a company I believe called GTL. They said GTL issued, and you can buy music, movies, and do phone calls on that.
And he says at one point Richard Allen even broke this tablet
in sort of a fit, essentially.
And generally speaking, when a prisoner breaks the tablet, they have to pay for the replacement.
$250.
They did not make Richard Allen pay for that.
They just replaced it with some agreement about him working on his mental health and making progress on that. So he's basically making the case, we're not just treating this guy normally, we're treating him better than most Westville maximum control unit prisoners.
He's checked out medically almost daily. They allow him to get face-to-face visits, even though no one else in that unit get them. They've been reluctant to allow attorneys to bring in cell phones and computers, but that he agrees they can make exceptions to that. He said the visits with attorneys have indeed been recorded by a camcorder through the window, as Max mentioned, but that has now been stopped at the request of the attorneys.
And my understanding was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but that was essentially happening because there was no camera recording in that area that they were meeting, so they felt they had to have something for safety reasons.
That was my understanding.
In case Allen lashed out and ended up hurting somebody.
And
that it was not sound recorded.
It was not sound recorded. There was an interesting moment where the warden said that Richard Allen has sent him 5 or 6 letters. And at that moment, Brad Rosie, who the revelation about the letters came from questioning via Nick McClelland. When that information came out, Brad Rosie asked to approach the bench. It was a bit of a conference.
Yes. And
then the subject was dropped.
Yeah. So wonder what was in those letters. We don't think that those are the confessions, though, because I mean, maybe this is my imagination, but McClelland talked about those going to different people.
Yes.
Yeah.
He said Richard Allen gets rec time, but he doesn't always take advantage of that recreation time. And the warden says, I have no concerns for Richard Allen's safety where he is currently housed.
Yeah. Basically, here's the thing. This was Nick McClelland's basically like pushback against the entire narrative of how things were portrayed in that filing. Basically saying that, it's an attempt to, and I believe Brad Rosie quoted this at one point, but essentially curry favor and curry sympathy, essentially, from the public.
Right.
And make everybody say, poor Richard Allen, and it's not necessarily based on facts. So McClelland was pushing this hard, and I will tell you, I think this was effective. It
was effective, and then it came time for Brad Rosie to do his cross-examination.
So this is his chance to regain some ground.
He really pushed hard against this warden. He said, this guy, Richard Allen, is being detained alongside the worst of the worst. And he says, would you concede that his mental health is worse now than when he was admitted? And the warden said, no, I won't concede that.
I don't know him.
Some days he seems to be almost fine. Other days he has bad days. So I'm not going to say that the general mental health is worse.
Also, if he's guilty, then whatever mental health would drive you to kill 2 kids, it's already going to be pretty bad. That's not, that moment. There were so many moments where they were just needling each other. It was crazy.
Brad Rosie said, isn't it true you didn't let me come in and inspect the cell?
Christ.
And the warden said that was a very unusual request. And so basically I don't think they knew how to handle it because it didn't come up.
I think this is where Rosie ran into a bit of trouble that kind of will come back later. Can I get into that? The whole it being inconvenient for him, or should we save that?
Well, let's save that. Let's get back to that. Then the next point was, I think this is very interesting. The next point was talking about how Richard Allen can call family members from his tablet and even talk about the case.
Yep.
And it's indicated all inmate calls are monitored and recorded. And it came out that the state has offered the defense recordings of calls to family from Richard Allen. So reading between the lines of all of this, I think there is a significant possibility that some of Richard Allen's alleged confessions may have come in phone calls to his family.
And my question would be, Kevin, as a person incarcerated, whether they're in prison or in jail, do they have any expectation of privacy in phone calls to their family outside?
No. The only expectation of privacy you would have would be in a phone call to your attorney.
Okay. So if he confessed and those are compelling confessions, those are in.
Yeah, I think it would be very difficult to come up with an argument to not include those confessions at the trial. Now, the defense can certainly say, well, he did say this thing which sounds like a confession, but look, it doesn't make sense, or he said it is a joke, or it's inconsistent, or he wasn't in his right frame of mind. He was just making things up. It was a fantasy.
Right.
So, but I think the alleged confessions are very likely to come in, and the defense will try to figure out a way to make the argument that the so-called confessions are not what they appear to be.
And frankly, this puts the entire emphasis that's coming from the defense on Alan's mental health deterioration into a new light, because it's not just something that they're concerned about for their client. Obviously, I'm sure that's part of it. But this is also something that if you have damning confessions or even things that you think are going to sound pretty bad to a jury, then you're going to want those explained. And one explanation would be he's losing his mind in here and he just said these things, and it's just the babbling of a person who is very, very stressed out and having their life unravel and is having struggles because of that mentally, not somebody who is the killer.
The warden remains very calm throughout all this.
Yeah, just totally cool.
Remember we said earlier about how there was this visit with Kathy Allen where Richard Allen wasn't allowed water. Brad Rosie brings that up and said, that was pretty bad, wasn't it? And the warden gave no ground. Yeah. Indicate that's basically policy and procedure. Brad Rosie says, I read some articles where it says Westville doesn't meet modern safety measures. What about that? And the warden says, I haven't seen articles like that. And
I felt like
Brad Rosie was like, wasn't there a story where there was a $400,000 settlement because of mistreatment at Westville? And the warden was like, well, nothing like that's happened since I've been there.
Yeah, I feel like there were a lot of areas here where he just kind of parried with him a lot, and there wasn't a lot of like ceding ground, and it was just kind of like, well, that's your opinion, or like, well, that's the rules, so we're not going to bend the rules for you. And that definitely it was interesting to see.
And we got an indication for the first time here that, in the famous pic of Richard Allen in prison, that his clothing was soiled because Richard Allen was wearing a shirt he had just worn during a recreation period. And that's not what he would typically wear.
Yeah.
And then, in fact, there was more discussion of that picture because on the redirect from Nick McClelland, Nick says, let's put this photo in context. And then he reads, this motion that they filed said that Richard Allen is kept in a room no bigger than a dog kennel, and he's treated like a prisoner of war. And when McClelland read those words, his voice was just dripping with sarcasm.
Yeah.
So at the time the picture was taken, according to Nick McClelland and the warden, Richard Allen had just been in the rec area for 45 minutes. And apparently Richard Allen uses the same shirt each time he goes to rec in order to save his other shirts. He had multiple clean clothes and commissary clothes in his cell. And he had an opportunity to change before meeting with the attorneys and chose not to. And he's certainly not clothed like that on a daily basis.
And I want to say one quietly devastating part of this whole exchange was when basically I think Rosie at one point sort of questioned, like, well, how would you know that, to the warden? And the warden was basically like, well, I watched the videotape where he goes back to his cell and then does not change. And I was like, ooh, wow. Yeah, that, I think both of us found this warden to be a pretty devastating.
He was a very compelling witness.
Yeah.
Utterly unflappable. So that was the end of the witnesses. So then Brad Rosie stands up. He says, we are consumed as a defense team with dealing with his detention. He said confessions, non-confessions, incriminating statements, non-incriminating statements, we'll deal with that. But this detention issue needs to be dealt with first. He talked a lot about the issues. he seemed to focus a lot about the difficulty he has as an attorney in meeting with Richard Allen.
Yes, or the inconvenience of like being in a prison.
And having to drive an hour and a half to meet with Richard Allen.
And then like go into uncomfortable rooms.
And so after he finished speaking, do you have the Gull quote or do you want me to read it?
You can read it.
After he finished speaking, Judge Gull said, "Your argument seems to focus on your own convenience. When you were appointed, you knew about the hour and a half drive."
That was brutal. Yeah. And I want to talk a bit about that because I'm going to say the caveat at the beginning that I actually tend to kind of see where the defense is coming from on this. Like I really kind of felt like a portion of what they were saying was very compelling. So I'm going to get to that later. But like I felt the focus on the convenience and throwing in all these details together kind of then just gave the impression where it's like, yeah, you're not going to give Westville, like 5 stars. It's a bad place for anybody to be. It's a prison. But like a lot of the kind of maybe putting out a narrative about like, look, his shirt is torn. Look, it's dirty. Maybe kind of like when then that's kind of being swatted away effectively, then it kind of becomes like, okay, what are we complaining about that's Richard Allen specific? What are we complaining about that is prison generalities that everyone has to deal with? And also what is just like not fun for a lawyer to have to deal with? And I'm going to circle back to where I kind of felt where the defense nailed it. And I just do want to say that I think they kind of got a little bit in the weeds with that. And I think maybe came away with maybe just a little bit more muddled than you would want to have. I mean, I don't know. What did you think?
Yeah, I agree with your analysis.
I'm going to say this, though. I mean, they made a point later. At the end of the day, he's a pretrial detainee, and they're typically not held in Westville.
Yeah.
And maybe that's all that really matters. I would say if that's all that really matters, then maybe like we shouldn't be trying to set a media narrative with photos, right? I mean, if that was what that was, or maybe it was just totally sincere. But at the end of the day, I think when you have a person who's not been convicted in a pretty heavy situation like that, maybe there should be some sort of compromise eked out. Even if, frankly, it seems like the people who made that decision had a good reason to do so. And a lot of that seemed to be like not wanting to have this guy's blood on their hands because they don't feel a jail is a safe place for him.
So then Nick McClelland stood up to make his own closing remarks. He said, the state doesn't really have a huge concern about where he is housed. And then he casually throws in another reference to the fact, there was multiple confessions in this case. He says, it doesn't sound like a Richard Allen situation at Cass County would be that much different from what it is now. Maybe a little bit worse because he won't have the mental health services. And he says, I think this is about convenience to Mr. Rosie. Rosie stands up to offer a few final words. He says, the prosecution keeps talking about multiple confessions, but it is a situation where Allen says one thing and then says something else a moment later. It's not like he broke down and told a consistent story.
Okay, yep.
And they said, and it's not just about my convenience, because if it's inconvenient for me, then it's inconvenient for my client because the quality of my representation suffers.
And I think that is a fair point for them to be making. If they're spending all of their time driving or like planning to drive, and I think it sounds like Westville should probably be able to accommodate them better because it is a unique situation for him. It's not a situation where they're his appellate attorneys or anything. They're representing him pre-trial. Maybe the compromise is if he stays in Westville, they are allowed better access to him, or he's moved to somewhere like Cass. I don't know. I think I end up kind of seeing their point, even if I think they got bodied on the whole, picture thing. I mean, that was just that. Yeah.
And then Rosie was like, a lot of this seems to come down to issues of how he will be transported. And so is all of this just because we can't get a van? We can put a man on the moon, but we can't get a van.
Yeah, that was great. Judge Gull backed him up on something, though. I think Nick McClellan made a reference basically of like, you like kind of on the law, on basically like, we're going to throw out this whole thing. And she kind of ended up being like, it's just a modified safekeeping order. So like, let's calm down. So she ended up pulling for Rosie on one thing.
So then she's going to take this all under advisement. And then they actually ended up setting a trial date.
Yeah, that was kind of that was pretty surprising to me.
Gull says it will probably need about 2 weeks for this trial, and Rosie said no, maybe 3 weeks. So
at least.
So the trial is now set for January 8th, 2024 to January 26th, 2024. Jury selection is going to take place in Allen County. Judge Gull says, I have one of the most sophisticated jury systems in the country. Mm-hmm. And she imagines that it would take from January 8th to the 10th or possibly to the 11th to get the jury.
Yes. So that's the date that's currently on the books, and we'll be looking forward to that. And yeah, it's one of those things where I feel ultimately this was kind of a situation where you had a lot of like legal talent going back and forth, and it was really interesting to see. You know, Baldwin was very quiet, but we know, from our past reporting that he's also very good in the courtroom. So it'll be interesting to see him kind of come into this eventually. But just between Rosie and McClelland, lots of really important points, lots of kind of almost thrilling moments where they're kind of, it's like watching fencers or something. It
was a very interesting day, and there'll be more interesting days ahead.
Anything else to add?
I don't think so. Let's wrap up.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service, and, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours. And cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, like disastrous. I mean, like I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life-threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about. And it either went horribly wrong, or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly like think about ingredients. And we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen, but HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned, and the instructions are super clear. So like, you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky. And I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here, because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code MSHEET16